Have you ever met someone who thinks they're a critical thinker just because they question everything? They don't trust the media, they reject institutions, they don't believe in science or experts. But here is the problem. Doubting everything is not critical thinking. It is just skepticism without a plan. And if you're not careful, it can turn you into what you're trying to avoid, a person who is easily manipulated. In this episode, we're breaking down the biggest mistakes that those wannabe free thinkers make, and we look at ways to avoid becoming one. My name is Kevin, and I have too many interests, not enough time, and a drive to understand the world better. It is easy to believe that rejecting the mainstream narratives will actually make you a free thinker. But here's the thing. Free thinking is not simply about rejecting others' ideas, but about finding ways to evaluate them. When people reject institutions, but they don't replace them by a solid and reliable method of inquiry, they don't become more informed. It's quite the opposite. They become more susceptible to misinformation. Take conspiracy theorists, for example. They pride themselves as going against the system, not believing what they're being told, and yet they jump on the first possible explanation, no matter how BS it can be.
Sometimes you are wrong in life, and I thought that there was no 24-hour sun. In fact, I was pretty sure of it. But I respect Will Duffy for being a stand-up guy, at least in the way that he kept saying it was true. I kept saying it wasn't. He said, "Do you want to go? I'll take you," and brought me here. And it's a fact. The sun does circle you in the south.
If your only criteria for truth is not what the mainstream says, you haven't escaped the system. You just replaced one blind belief for another. As philosopher Karl Popper pointed out, critical thinking is not about rejecting authority, but about demanding falsifiability. And what does that mean? Well, that means that each idea we have needs to be questioned, challenged, and tested, and not blindly trusted simply because they go against the norm. We like to believe that we can figure out everything for ourselves, but the reality is we can't. Almost everything we know comes from someone else. And if you don't trust me, I made a video about this topic that I will link in the description. The executive summary is that we depend on others for our knowledge. Ask yourself, do you personally have the expertise to assess the effectiveness of a vaccine, for example, or make sure that a bridge will stand when a truck goes on it? Or can you even assess the accuracy of a history book? How do you know Napoleon was living at some point? You might be great, but just not that great. And so what do? You rely on experts that have spent their lives studying these things. And that doesn't mean that you're trusting them blindly, but that simply means that you recognize that some sources are more trustworthy than others. And skepticism is healthy, but it must be paired with intellectual humility. If we dismiss experts without replacing them, we're not thinking critically. We're just inflating our own biases, and we will trust whatever our own intuition is saying we should. And the real challenge is that critical thinking is hard work, and most people are not ready to dedicate the time to develop it. Because figuring out what is true takes efforts. It requires us to read beyond simply the headlines of an article or what we see on social media. We need to look for other sources. And I think the most painful one for most people is simply to say, I don't actually know enough to have a strong opinion on this topic. Let me say that again. I don't have a strong enough understanding of the topic to take a position. We can sometimes vote blank. We don't need to have an opinion on everything. But in a world where quick answers are more appealing than nuanced discussions, most people will go with their emotions and go with the simple explanations. And I have another quote from the philosopher Bertrand Russell for you, because I think he managed to put in words concepts that are so interesting. And he says, in all affairs, it is a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the things you have long taken for granted. And so true critical thinking embraces doubt, not as an excuse to believe nothing, but to develop the tools to refine the ideas that we actually do believe. And the uncomfortable truth is that most of us don't have the time or don't want to dig deeper into those topics. And actually, this is the case for everybody. We select the topics that we want to dig deeper in. For the other topics that we don't want to invest much time in, we have to use shortcuts. And so those are heuristics, experts, or consensus. And that is totally fine to use them because we have to. But we have to know which one to trust and which one to disregard. So rejecting all sources is a mistake. So what can we do to actually think critically and avoid ending up one of these wannabe free thinkers? Before dismissing or accepting new information, ask yourself, am I rejecting this idea because it is untrue or because it challenges my worldview? And many studies have been made on that, especially on political debates. If you read information that supports your worldview, you're going to accept it quite easily. However, if something goes and contradicts it, you will find ways to say, actually, I won't consider this information, I don't trust it. Even when the sources are actually reputable. So the key is don't abandon skepticism fully, but apply it evenly to the sources that you believe in and the sources that challenges your view. And so as we said, what is important is to realize that not all sources are equal. There is a certain hierarchy and we need to understand it. A random Reddit thread is not the same as a peer-reviewed study. A YouTube video is not the same as a meta-analysis of 50 years of research. So the more rigorous the process, the more reliable the information. 3, be comfortable with I don't know. And sometimes you just have to say, I don't know. And I know I need to say it, but admitting that we don't know something is not a weakness. It is actually a sign of real intelligence. Because the strongest thinkers are not the ones that have an answer for everything. They're the ones that understand the limits of their knowledge. Of course, scientific consensus is not perfect, but it is built on years of research, on peer review, and on debates. So instead of rejecting it from the beginning, you need to ask critical questions to assess if it's actually reliable or not. So ask yourself, why does this consensus exist? What are the evidence supporting it? And if I reject this information, do I have a better explanation, a stronger evidence to explain the topic? And now some of you will say, hey, you say that the scientific consensus should be trusted, but you're called breaking consensus. Isn't that weird? And I'm saying not at all. This is exactly what breaking consensus is about. Because it is not about rejecting mainstream ideas without any evidence, and it is not about following them blindly either. It is about critically examining them, trying to understand why they are there, what are the evidence behind, and should we still believe in this or should we change our mind? If a consensus is based on strong evidence, then we should engage with it seriously. But if a consensus exists because of traditions or personal interests or ideologies, then it needs to be challenged, and in the worst case, broken. I talked about doing the work, but we don't need to do the work all the time. As I said before, there are way too many topics in life. We cannot be an expert on everything else, so we need to rely on others for some of those topics. But when something is important for you, it could be because of your health, it could be your finances, or the beliefs that you have about the world, take the time to go and dig deeper to understand what is true. If you refuse to trust mainstream sources, then be prepared to put in the work to find a solid alternative. If you don't do that, then you cannot honestly believe that you're thinking critically and that you're aiming at the truth. And if that's you, that makes you a wannabe free thinker. So as we saw, critical thinking is not simply about rejecting ideas, it is about finding ways to evaluate, question, and refine our own beliefs. And blind skepticism is as bad as blind faith. And I realized that we talked a lot in this video about skepticism, but skepticism is another of these terms that is often misused and misunderstood. In the next episode, we will dive into the history of skepticism, and we will look at where it comes from, what it is actually, and how philosophers have shaped it over time. See you on the next one.